Today, I've entitled the Devar, Three Zealous Men. All three expressed what might be called righteous anger. The men we're looking at are Pinhas, Eliyahu, and Shaul. So firstly, let's look at the actions of Pinhas. Today, we commenced our parashah by reading from verse 1 of chapter 25, rather than verse 10, where the parashah normally begins, because the first 9 verses set the stage of the narrative as it relates to Pinhas. But before we consider what Pinhas did, we need to look at the background of the circumstances at that time. In chapter 25, verses 1 to 3, we're told about the anger of Yahweh, which had been blazing up against Israel yet again. This time because the men were whoring with the women of Moab and were being led to bow down to the god Baal Peor. Yahweh was so angry with the actions of Israel that he ordered Moshe to take all the chiefs of the people and hang them facing the sun. Now it's interesting that Yahweh required them to be hung facing the sun, because according to history, Baal was the ancient weather god who was thought to control lightning, wind, thunder, and rain, and of course fertility. Scholars have suggested that the people of Canaan and Mesopotamia during that period relied upon Baal to provide the much needed rain. Looking at a quote from Wikipedia, it says the dry summers of that area explain why Baal was at that time in the underworld, and his return in the autumn was said to cause the storms that revived the land. Thus, the worship of Baal in Canaan eventually supplanted the worship of El as the leader of the pantheon of gods, because of the region's dependency on rainfall for its agriculture. The region was different, of course, from Egypt and Mesopotamia, because both of them focused on the 2 rivers for their irrigation. Now Yahweh, by requiring Israel's chiefs to be hung facing the sun, became a direct affront to the worship and reliance upon Baal. So by acting on those instructions, Moshe turned the fury of Yahweh away from Israel. However, along with the execution of those clan chiefs, Yahweh also required the tribal judges to put to death anyone else who had actually joined themselves with Baal Peor. Now this command of Yahweh must be seen in context. All the leaders on the plains of Moab were the ones who were less than 20 years old when the spies returned with bad reports over 38 years earlier. So when Yahweh gave the command to execute the clan chiefs, those individuals would have been around 50 to 60 years old. They had been there when all their parents slowly died, along with the ones that actually brought back the bad reports. They also saw what happened to Korach and his cohort when the ground opened up and swallowed them. So they had no excuse for the behavior of the people on the plains of Moab, because by that stage they were the chiefs of the clans. Yahweh was fully justified in making an example of them in front of the whole of the people. The whole process was a hard lesson for Israel, and if they defied Yahweh and sought after foreign gods, they would pay a very heavy price. Even while Moshe was still purging the camp, yet another corrupt clan leader named Zimri brought Cosby, a Midianite, right through the assembly, past the Mishkan, into his family's tent. As we're told in verses 7 and 8, Pinhas, grandson of Aaron, reacted violently and swiftly, thrusting a spear straight through both of them as they copulated in the tent. The New Study Bible, that some of you have got, the CJB version, has an interesting footnote regarding verses 14 and 15, where it says, both Zimri and Cosby were from prestigious families. Therefore, Pinchas took a great risk when he slew them both. He could have set off a civil war within Israel by killing the leader of one tribe when he was the leader of another. He also could have provoked a bloody war between Israel and Midian by killing their princess. However, the outcome was completely different. Yahweh was well pleased with the zeal of Pinchas, making a very important statement in verses 12 and 13, where he says, I am giving Pinchas my covenant of shalom, making a covenant with him and his descendants after him, so that the office of Cohen will be theirs forever. This is because he was so zealous on behalf of his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. That was an important statement, because up until that point in time, there was only one person remaining alive who was qualified to become the Kohen Gadol. By that stage, of course, Aaron had died, and the mantle had passed to his son Eleazar, but Pinchas, who was the son of Eleazar, was not anointed for the future appointment of Kohen Gadol. So if Yahweh had not made a covenant of shalom with Pinchas, the role would have passed to Aaron's second son, Itamar, assuming that he outlived Eleazar. As Itamar had no sons, who would follow on as the next generation's Kohen Gadol? There would have been a family dispute in the house of Cohen. However, by his actions, Pinchas paved the way for the office of Cohen to pass on down through his line of descent for many generations. Chapter 25 concludes with Yahweh telling Moshe in verses 17 through 19 that he was to treat the Midianim as enemies because of the way that they had treated Israel on the plains of Moab. Midianim had been responsible for leading the people of Israel into sexual and religious depravity. However, it must have been hard for Moshe to take that action against the people of Midian, because his own family was part of that nation. After all, Zipporah, Moshe's wife, was a Midianite, and so his two sons were half Midianites. Eleazar, the Kohen Gadol, had also married a Midianite woman, who was possibly closely related to Zipporah. So then why did Yahweh spare Moab and yet hold Midian highly responsible? Maybe because Moab were direct descendants from Abraham's nephew Lot. Also, as we saw last week, Yeshua is the one who will crush the corners of Moab, and he will destroy the descendants of Shet, whom we see are the people of Shittim from the area of Moab. They are being held over for a future destruction, along with Ammon and Edom, as we considered last week. Now, there are many other important features also worthy of consideration in this week's parashah, but time does not permit for us to consider them today. So, I hope that you'll have time to read the parashah during the week to appreciate how Yahweh dealt with that second generation of Israel there on the plains of Moab. So moving on, Eliyahu and the Baal prophets. Like Pinchas, Eliyahu, our second character, expressed his zeal on behalf of Yahweh through the narrative in the book of 1 Kings. There he demonstrates that Yahweh is the only and true God, and that Baal is nothing more than a figment of the human imagination. Having proven his point at on Mount Carmel, Eliyahu rounded up all 450 Baal worshippers and slaughtered them. Just like Pinhas, Eliyahu took the matter into his own hands. But rather than being praised for his actions, he was forced to flee to Mount Horeb. Now when he gets there, he's challenged by Yahweh himself. "What are you doing here, Eliyahu?" Eliyahu responds, "I have been very zealous for Yahweh, God of armies, because of the people of Israel, have abandoned your covenant and broken down your altars and killed your prophets with swords. Now I am the only one left, and they are trying to kill me too." What was Yahweh's response? He confronts Eliyahu with three powerful forces of nature: the mighty wind, a raging earthquake, and a roaring inferno, probably in a volcanic eruption. But God was not present in any of these forces of nature. Instead, after that, he reveals himself to Eliyahu with a still, small voice, saying again, "What are you doing here, Eliyahu?" In his own defense, Eliyahu repeats all that he'd said earlier in verse 10. There was no expression of gratitude from Yahweh towards Eliyahu for his zealous actions. Instead, he was given more instructions on what to do next. In verses 15 through 17, Yahweh tells Eliyahu, "Turn northward through the desert towards Damascus. There you are to appoint Hazael king over Aram. Then after crossing the Jordan, you are to appoint Jehu as king over the 10 tribes of Israel. And finally, next, you are to appoint Eleazar to be the prophet of Yahweh, who will carry on the work after you, Eliyahu, are taken off the scene." Finally, Eliyahu was told that each anointed king would be serving Yahweh. Jehu had to kill all those who had escaped the sword of Hazael, king of Aram. Then any that escaped the sword of Jehu were to be killed by Elisha. That is how Yahweh planned to purge Israel from Baal worshippers. Even though Yahweh did not praise Eliyahu for killing the 450 Baal worshippers, he did give him reassurance that his zealous actions were not in vain. However, by instructing Eliyahu as he did, Yahweh made it abundantly clear that it is always Yahweh who commands the death of rebellious people, particularly in Israel. He does not delegate that responsibility to any man or woman. Then Eliyahu was taken off the scene before the killing started. In that way, Yahweh alone would carry out the purging of the people. Yahweh concludes his instructions to Eliyahu by giving him a gentle reminder that he is not the only one in the whole of Israel who had stood apart from Baal. In verse 18 he says, "Still I will spare 7,000 in Israel whose knees have not bent to Baal." Decades later, Assyria did take the 10 tribes away into exile, and they have remained there to this day. But even after the dispersion of those northern tribes, the people of Yehudah still turned their backs on Yahweh, corrupting themselves just as their brothers in the north had done. We're told by Jeremiah the ultimate outcome for Yehudah was that they too would be taken into exile. However, after 70 years in Babylon, Yahweh allowed Yehudah back to the land of Eretz Israel. As we know from the words of Jeremiah, and more particularly Ezekiel, the tribe of Yehudah was no better than their brothers in the 10 tribes of the north. So why did Yahweh allow them to go back to the land? It was because the tribe of Yehudah was the one through whom Yeshua, the Mashiach, was to be born. It was not that they deserved to return, but because they alone had been ordained to deliver the Mashiach. That's recorded for us, of course, by the third patriarch, Yaakov. In Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, it says, "The scepter will not pass from Yehudah, nor the ruler's staff from between his legs, until he comes, to whom obedience belongs." By the time of Yeshua's death, resurrection, and presentation to his Father on Bikurim, all the unbelieving people of Yehudah had determined in their own minds that Yeshua was standing against the Torah. And of course, that's why he was put to death. He was an enemy of the people. Just 50 days after Yeshua had ascended to the Father on Bikurim, he sent the Ruach HaKodesh down upon the faithful Talmudim. All of them were gathered for the celebration of Shavuot. Then the rebellion against the Messianic faithful increased. As we read throughout the book of Acts, the persecution continued for another 40 years until the second temple was destroyed. And finally, the rebellious Yehudah was cast out into the Roman diaspora, where it spent the next 38 Yovels, or 1900 years, amongst the nations. The persecution of the Messianic community began with the stoning of Stephen, as we read, and continued through the actions of the young, zealous Pharisee named Shaul, who was determined to stamp out this newly formed Messianic community. Enter Shaul, the emissary. He's the third character that we're looking at this morning. Like Pinhas and Eliyahu before him, he took zealous actions into his own hands. This time it was against the followers of Yeshua. Armed with a warrant from the Kohen Gadol, he set out on a murderous rampage, seeking to bring to trial members of the Messianic community, all that he could find. He was on his way to Damascus, to round them up and take them back to Jerusalem. His charge was that all who followed Yeshua were deemed to be standing against the principles and teachings of Torah. Shaul's zeal was unstoppable. That is, until he had the encounter on the road with Yeshua on the road to Damascus. As with Pinhas, with whom Yahweh had made a covenant of shalom, and Eliyahu, whom he had taken off the scene before facing death, Shaul was now being given a new commission. He was to spend the rest of his earthly life taking the good news of Yeshua and the kingdom of God, firstly to the Roman world, and then further on to the Goyim of the Hellenistic regions of the Roman Empire. So in summarizing what we've looked at, each of these three zealous men stood up for Yahweh and Torah, and in their zeal they carried out what they perceived to be the will of God. In response, Yahweh gave each man an additional responsibility by extending the roles that they would play in the future of Israel. Firstly, Pinhas was given the covenantal promise that his descendants would always be the ones to produce the Kohen HaGadol in every generation to follow. Secondly, Eliyahu was sent to anoint Hazazel, king of Aram, Jehu, king of Israel, and finally to anoint Elisha as his own replacement. These three appointees were to continue cleaning up the work that Eliyahu had started in the midst of Israel. Thirdly, Shaul, part of the Perishim, was commissioned by Yahweh, Yeshua himself, to spread the message about the Mashiach. Firstly to the Perishim, and then to the Jews living in the diaspora. And finally he was to be sent out to spread the word around among the Goyim. Each of these three men acted zealously for Yahweh against their own people Israel. Not one of them tried to change the way of the Goyim. Instead they focused solely on Israel. Each of those three men was shown that Yahweh alone is responsible for taking vengeance against any human being, whether it's in Israel or any other nation. However, in each of these situations, the actions taken brought about changes in the community of Israel. Each example Yahweh used to bring his people further forward. By contrast, there were at least two major revolts in Jewish history, which were sparked also by zealous leaders. The first revolt, between 66 and 74 CE, was started by Menahem ben Yehuda, a member of the Sakai movement, also known as the Zealots, who caused an insurrection and took control of the Second Temple, leading to its destruction in 70 CE. The second revolt was started by Bar Kokhba in 132 CE, which led to the uprising against the Roman authorities, which led to the removal of Jews from Jerusalem in 135 CE. And they remained in the diaspora until 1948. And the whole region was renamed by Emperor Hadrian as, rather than Yehuda, it became known as Palestine. So where does that leave the people of Israel today? If we look back at the 28th of September 2000, Ariel Sharon, as leader of the Likud party, just months before he became Prime Minister, led a delegation of about 1,000 security guards up onto the Temple Mount. During his visit, he is quoted as saying, "The Temple Mount is in our hands and will remain in our hands. It is the holiest site in Judaism, and it is right for every Jew to be able to visit the Temple Mount." Those were the words of a true zealot. But were those words justified? His justification for the visit appears to have been based on claims by Israeli archaeologists that priceless antiquities were being destroyed by excavations being undertaken by the Muslim Waqf, who were working towards building a new mosque in the southwestern corner of the site. He was clearly not acting on behalf of Yahweh. Rather, his actions were purely for political reasons. His actions were soon followed by the outbreak of the Second Intifada. While relatively short-lived, it showed clearly that politically driven acts of zeal can cause damage rather than progress. Now, what we saw through the actions of Pinhas, Eliyahu, and Shaul advanced the sovereign plan of God. By contrast, the actions of Menahem, Bar Kokhba, and Sharon all caused great damage for the people of Israel. Whatever happens in the future will doubtless be the result of the actions of zealous men. But will their zeal be for the support of Yahweh or for political gain? As Talmudim of Yeshua, we would do well to reflect on the words of our Master, the words that he said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, "How blessed are those who make peace, for they will be called sons of God." Shabbat Shalom.